Hello. Good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started quite soon. Just waiting for some of the speakers to come up to the front. My name is Gary Lee. I'm the Mekong Program Manager for International Rivers, and I'll be moderating the panel this evening. I'd like to welcome you all to this event, Silence in the Mekong, the making of Xayaburi Dam from commencement to operations. It was 9 years ago today, actually, that the formal prior consultation process for the Xayaburi Dam formally started. This is a regional consultation process that is required under the 1995 Mekong Agreement for projects that are planned for the Mekong mainstream. As the first dam on the lower Mekong mainstream, the Xayaburi Dam has been and continues to be a highly controversial project. It was also around 9 years ago, actually October 2010, when a major study which was commissioned by the Mekong River Commission, or the MRC, that examined the risks and implications of hydropower projects planned for the Mekong mainstream and what that might mean for the river, its people, the economy, and the region more broadly. And a key recommendation of that study was that there should be a 10-year moratorium on proposed projects on the Mekong mainstream given the size of the risks involved. Yet, despite the widespread concerns and the scientific evidence pointing to the threats and the risks, the Xayaburi Dam proceeded. And here we are now, 9 years later, and the project is about to start commercial operations next week, and majority of the electricity will be sold to Thailand. But the question still remains, is it a necessary project? So according to data that is on the website of the Thai utility, or EGAT, this year we have seen Thailand have a reserve margin of 30%, where greater supply than demand, which is equivalent to around 12,000 megawatts of installed capacity. To put that into perspective, that is equivalent to almost 10 Xayaburi dams. So tonight we have a panel of 5 speakers that will be presenting and sharing different aspects of the Xayaburi project and its implications for the river, the basin, and its people. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker, who is Dr. Carl Middleton, who is the Director of Center for Social Development Studies at Chulalongkorn University. Carl.
Thank you, Gary. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I've been asked to speak about the recent history and context, so I think building very much on the way that Gary's framed this panel. So what I'll hope to do is to basically give a sense of the way that the decision making has unfolded and some of the key reports that have been developed in the process, and then some conclusions on what we've observed over the last 9 years and what it means both for decision making going forward as well as more broadly for the region. So I think the first thing to recognize is that these projects have a long history. Although Gary said that it started 9 years ago, there is a longer context, that the original vision to dam the Mekong mainstream goes all the way back to the 1950s. And then, although it was not possible at the time with the Second Indochina War, but then was revived in the early 1990s as broadly peace returned to the region. But then again, in the early 1990s, although the projects were proposed, the Asian financial crisis very much took them off the agenda again. They were revived again in the early 2000s, and I think the current iteration of projects that we see now reflect the project developers that initiated them at that time. So the project developers for the Mekong Mainstream Dam as a whole are mainly from China, Malaysia, Thailand and Vietnam. And the Xayaburi Dam was the first project to proceed to construction. And so therefore it's kind of broken a path forward for the subsequent projects that have been proposed. And as Gary said, the plans for the Xayaburi Dam has attracted much controversy, and for good reason. So there's been a series of agreements around the Xayaburi. So this is, again, just setting the background, that the Memorandum of Understanding on the project was signed in 2007. But then in 2009, 2010, a Strategic Environmental Assessment report was commissioned and completed, and I'll discuss some of these in more detail in a minute. There was another important process called the Procedures for Notification, Prior Consultation and Agreement, that again I'll discuss in more detail, but essentially this process is significant because it was a key regional decision-making process through the Mekong River Commission, which is an intergovernmental commission amongst the lower Mekong countries. Then another important decision taken related to Thailand's commitment to buy electricity from the project, and again I'll discuss this in more detail in a second, that enabled the groundbreaking of the project formally, although the project had actually started construction in 2010. I'll also mention in passing about some of the civil society and public interest lawyer work that's been undertaken that I think the panel will also develop further with the other speakers. And then obviously the reason why we're meeting today is because the project is due to be commissioned very shortly. And so this is a very salient time to look at how we got to this point and what it means for the Mekong. So to briefly mention who's involved. So the project developers, this is a private sector project led by the Thai company Chor Khan Chang. It formed a project consortium in March 2011 that included other Thai companies, PTT and EGCO and Bangkok Expressway, as well as a Lao company. Financing is also primarily from Thailand via 4 commercial banks and the Thailand Import-Export Bank. The project itself is the first project to fully block the Mekong in the lower Mekong basin. So there have been projects developed upstream in China already, which again, to discuss that would be far longer than we have to discuss on the panel. But it's significant because it's the first project in the lower Mekong on the mainstream. So to briefly talk about some of the key decision-making points and their significance. As the projects were first beginning to be discussed from the mid-2000s and they gained momentum, the Mekong River Commission commissioned a study called the Strategic Environmental Assessment. So this was not specifically on Xayaburi. This was a study that looked at all of the 11 proposed lower Mekong mainstream dams. It started in June 2009, and it had a series of expert consultations as well as an extensive desk-based review. So the report was formally launched in the middle of October 2010. And as Gary mentioned, it essentially recommended that there should be a precautionary moratorium for at least 10 years, given the knowledge gaps that existed and the need, therefore, for further studies. But it's also important to note that the MRC governments did not formally endorse this strategic environmental assessment through the MRC, but it's not to say that the strategic environmental assessment was insignificant. The study itself continued to be cited over the following years, and the knowledge that it created really influenced the dams debate. The second important process that unfolded was the procedures for notification prior consultation and agreement, or the PNPCA process. So significantly, this is hosted by the Mekong River Commission, and it's under the Mekong Agreement that it's an agreement that the governments will consult each other before going ahead with projects on the mainstream. Significantly, if you look at the dates carefully, you'll notice that the government of Laos initiated the PNPCA shortly before the Strategic Environmental Assessment, presumably with the knowledge that the SEA was going to make a recommendation that there be a moratorium. So public consultations were organized in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, but not in Laos, under the PNPCA. And during those consultations, various critical comments were made towards the project. The EIA report of the study of the project itself was only released after these consultations, but subsequently was heavily criticized by experts in civil society. So the project's EIA was criticized for the way that it looked at fisheries and sediments, that it didn't really study the cumulative impacts of the project in relation to other projects, and neither did it look at the transboundary impacts of the project on Thailand or other countries. It's also important to note that under the Mekong Agreement, countries are expected to negotiate in good faith. But at the same time, the Lao government went ahead to sign the concession agreement with the project, even as the PNPCA process had not been concluded. Shortly before the formal end of the PNPCA process, there was a Bangkok Post article that revealed that even though the PNPCA process was not concluded, preliminary construction had already started. So in a subsequent annual report from Cho Kan Chang, it was revealed that actually construction had been underway since late 2010. So again, this is raising the questions around the good faith negotiations. In terms of the conclusion of the PNPCA, there wasn't really a definitive and clear conclusion. This is from the MRC press release at the time. The essence of it says that the Lao government argued that there was no need to continue the process of decision-making because it had already taken account and listened to the neighboring countries. Meanwhile, the other governments, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, raised concerns about gaps in technical knowledge and the need for more public consultation. So the decision was deferred from the joint committee level, which is a lower level committee, to a higher level committee, which is the MRC annual ministerial level. But in the end, the project was not thoroughly discussed at that ministerial meeting, at least publicly. Given the ambiguity as to whether the project should go ahead under the PNPCA, further studies were commissioned, including one by the Finnish consultancy Puru. So they were commissioned by the government of Laos to evaluate whether the PNPCA could be considered to be concluded or not according to the MRC rules. And this was important because it was important for the government to be able to say it was concluded so that it could go ahead and sign contracts, and therefore financing would be released, and therefore the project could go ahead. So Poru's compliance report argued that the project was principally in compliance, but subsequent reviews of that report, including by the MRC Secretariat, questioned the findings of the Poru study. Although I don't have time to discuss this, subsequently 15 civil society groups questioned the role of Poru as a company itself, given a conflict of interest that Poru was also involved in the Xayaburi project itself. The government of Laos informed first Chor Khan Chang and then later the Ministry of Energy in Thailand that it considered the PNPCA process concluded. This was significant because it meant that the contracts could be signed. So the power purchase agreement between the company and the Ministry of Energy was signed in October 2011. Those of you that were in Bangkok at that time would be aware that there was flooding at that time, and the media was very much looking elsewhere, unfortunately. So signing the power purchase agreement essentially enabled the banks to release financing that would allow the project to go ahead. It's also important to note that Xayaburi actually did not have a long track record of being in the power development plan of Thailand. And so when questions were raised about that, it was essentially explained that the project had been fast-tracked into the power development plan of Thailand. The interpretation of whether the Thai government had followed the Thai constitution became the basis of a Thai administrative court case. This was path-breaking in the sense that it was the first time that a project from overseas with Thai investment was brought to a case in Thailand. But it wasn't questioning the role of the private companies, but rather the role of the Thai government, given that some Thai state and enterprises were partially involved in the project. It also raised questions as to whether the Thai government was required to follow the Thai constitution on public participation, given that the project, although located in Laos, would have impacts back onto Thailand again. So I think this may come up later in the discussion, that the Thai court case was first submitted in August 2012. First in the administrative court it was not accepted, but then the Supreme Administrative Court accepted the case in February 2013. In December 2015, the case was ruled against, and it's currently subject to appeal. This court case is significant because it also is the beginning of a process that Thai courts are an arena within which the role of Thai foreign direct investment can be inquired into. Jumping forward a bit, you'd have probably noticed that even a couple of months ago, Xayaburi was still in the news. This time in the context of the drought that happened in July 2019, where coinciding with the drought, the project was testing its turbines. So the question raised was whether the project was holding back water in order to test the turbines at a time when water was needed downstream. Now the company said that it was also the victim of the drought, but at the same time, data was not put in the public domain to demonstrate whether the company was holding back water or not. So in a very brief, we have 5 speakers. So to be very brief, if I was to summarize the past 9 years from my perspective, I think that the Xayaburi Dam has been subject to multiple formal decision-making processes that involve governments, the MRC, civil society, communities, academics, and others. It's attracted significant public debate, including not just within these formal processes, but within the media and within public forums. It's also been heavily scrutinized by various forms of research, by civil society, academics, and others. Although it was redesigned as a result of the PNPCA, it's still gone ahead, despite the many social and environmental harms that will happen, as well as other risks and uncertainties that are unclear. The project has been a path breaker for the other projects that are either under construction now, namely Don Sahong, or proposed projects which are the Pak Beng, Pak Lai, and Luang Prabang. And ultimately, the project still remains highly controversial and contested. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carl, for setting the scene and providing that background of the history of the project, which has been surrounded and subject to controversy, debate, and which still continues. And as Carl also highlighted, while the project is being built in Laos, there are regional factors and particular role that Thailand has played, both as a developer, financier, and the buyer of electricity, including potential impacts on Thai communities that are living along the Mekong. Our next speaker is Kun Ombun Tipsuna, who is a member of the Thai People's Network in 8 Mekong provinces that have been actively monitoring and campaigning on this issue, and she is also one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit on Xayaburi that's been filed against Thai state agencies that Carl mentioned. เชิญครับ
สวัสดีค่ะออมบุญทิพย์สุนาค่ะจากเครือข่ายประชาชนไทย8จังหวัดลุ่มน้ำโขงค่ะดิฉันไม่เข้าใจว่าพลังงาน
Sorry, I forgot to mention Kun Ombun will speak in Thai and we'll have sequential translation. So Pai there will translate into English because we didn't have enough headsets. So ขอโทษครับ
สถานการณ์การผลิตพลังงานที่กระทบวิถีชีวิตพี่น้องชาวบ้านนะคะ
My name is Ombun Tipsuna. I'd like to take this opportunity to share my view on my worry about how electricity is being produced on the cost of local people.
7 ปีผ่านไปที่ดร.คาวพูดเราได้ยื่นเรื่องที่ศาลปกครองจนถึงวันนี้จนเขื่อนสร้างเสร็จวิถีชีวิตของพี่น้องชาวบ้านที่กังวลที่ว่าจะได้รับผลกระทบอะไรวันนี้เกิดขึ้นแล้วค่ะ
7 years already that we filed a lawsuit at the Thai Administrative Court, and the dam is already complete, and we already experience unusual water fluctuation and impacts on our livelihoods.
ถึงวันนี้ไม่สามารถจะปฏิเสธได้ว่าเขื่อนชัยบุรีเป็นเขื่อนของคนไทยเพราะคนไทยลงทุนชอกันช่างเป็นคนก่อสร้างธนาคารไทยไม่ว่าจะเป็นแบงก์ไทยพาณิชย์แบงก์กรุงไทยแบงก์กสิกรแบงก์กรุงเทพเอ็กซิมแบงก์ลงทุนปล่อยกู้นะคะแล้วก็ซื้อขายไฟฟ้าเนี่ยขายให้กฟผ.ไทย
To this day, we can refuse that Xayaburi Dam is a Thai national dam based located in Laos because it's built by Thai construction company owned by Thai people, financed by different Thai banks, and the electricity is being exported to Thailand through EGAT.
เขื่อนจีนได้สร้างผลกระทบให้กับพี่น้องในฝั่งของประเทศไทยเนี่ยรวมทั้งสิ้นเนี่ย8จังหวัดแล้วก็ไซยบุรีเองเนี่ยทำให้แม่น้ำโขงผันผวนมากในตอนนี้
For the past decades, we already experienced the downstream impacts of upper Mekong dams in China, but Xayaburi Dam, which already trial on operation, exacerbate the downstream impacts to us, particularly those on Northeast Thailand.
เราประสบปัญหาน้ำท่วมหน้าแล้งน้ำแห้งหน้าฝนแล้วก็ในเดือนกรกฎาคมที่ผ่านมานี่เป็นภาพแม่น้ำโขงบริเวณอำเภอเชียงคานจังหวัดเลย
The slide I'm showing here is the Mekong River on Thai-Lao border in July, which supposed to be rainy season. So now we're experiencing flood in dry season and drought in rainy season.
ที่อยากโชว์ภาพนี้ให้เห็นแล้วก็เพิ่มเติมจากดร.คาวพูดก็คือว่าเดือนกรกฎาคมเนี่ยเป็นเดือนในฤดูเขาเรียกว่าภาษาชาวบ้านเรียกว่าน้ำหลากเป็นฤดูที่ทางกรมประมงเองเนี่ยประกาศว่าเป็นฤดูน้ำแดงแล้วก็ห้ามประชาชนไม่ให้จับปลาในฤดูวางไข่แต่ในขณะที่เดือนกรกฎาคมแม่น้ำโขงอยู่ในสภาพเช่นนี้ปลาที่จะอพยพขึ้นมาวางไข่ในลำห้วยก็ไม่สามารถที่จะทำได้แล้วก็ถูกจับแล้วก็ตายในแม่น้ำโขงอย่างมากในเดือนกรกฎาคมที่ผ่านมา
In the picture, you see that it's July, which we call the flood season. And during July, the Department of Fishery also announced forbidden people to do any fishery activities in the Mekong River because it's spawning season. But what happened is that migratory fish cannot swim to spawn in wetland or in tributaries, and they were caught with eggs in their stomach.
นี่เป็นภาพแก่งคุดคูที่บริเวณอำเภอเชียงคานจังหวัดเลยเป็นภาพสดๆร้อนๆเมื่อวานนะคะซึ่งเป็นแหล่งท่องเที่ยวที่สำคัญเป็นแหล่งหาปลาของชาวบ้านอยู่ในสภาพเช่นนี้
This is how Keng Kut Ku, which is a major rapids in Chiang Khan, looked like just yesterday. So we see the beach happier, even though it's the mid of rainy season.
นอกจากความผันผวนของแม่น้ำแล้วเนี่ยสิ่งที่เกิดขึ้นที่ก็นักวิชาการทางประมงได้ชี้ให้เห็นปัญหาที่สำคัญยิ่งก็คือว่าปลาหลงฤดูว่ายมา อพยพขึ้นมาเนี่ยไม่ถูกต้องตามฤดูกาลแล้วก็ที่สำคัญเวลาผ่าท้องออกดูแล้วเนี่ยไข่ปลาเนี่ยไม่อยู่ในสภาพที่สามารถที่พร้อมที่จะผสมพันธุ์หรือวางไข่โดยเฉพาะปลาอื่น
What the fishery expert told us is that the change of water fluctuation, particularly this time, disturbed the spawning of migratory fish in the Mekong. As you see in the photo, this kind of fish are not ready to lay their eggs and they already caught.
มันหมายถึงประเด็นการทดลองปั่นไฟของเขื่อนไซยบุรีแล้วก็ไม่คำนึงถึงฤดูน้ำหลากไม่คำนึงถึงทรัพยากรปลาทรัพยากรประมงที่จะเป็นปัญหามากขึ้นในอนาคตแล้วก็ในช่วงเดือนกรกฎาคมทางอดีตอธิบดีกรมประมงท่านอดิศรพร้อมเทพก็ลงพื้นที่พร้อมคณะเพื่อปรึกษาหารือกับพี่น้องเครือข่ายในพื้นที่เพื่อแก้ไขปัญหานี้
So we already see that during this time, the dam operates the trial operation without consideration of environmental flow as well as the impacts on migration of fish in the Mekong River. In this photo, the Department of Fishery visit the local community and consult how to deal with these impacts.
ปัญหาที่เกิดขึ้นไม่ใช่แค่เรื่องขาดแคลนน้ำเพื่อการเกษตรยังกระทบถึงเรื่องฤดูการท่องเที่ยวในช่วงที่แทนที่จะได้เล่นสงกรานต์ในช่วงหน้าแล้งน้ำกับท่วมในช่วงที่ถึงฤดูการออกพรรษาจะได้แข่งเรือกับไม่ได้ทำซึ่งส่งผลกระทบต่อวิถีชีวิตของคนลุ่มน้ำโขงอย่างมาก
So the lack of water in the Mekong River during flood season this year already create impacts on tourism as well as cultural activities.
สิ่งที่ทางไซยบุรีบอกว่าเป็นเขื่อนแบบไหลทิ้งภาพนี้ก็คงจะฟ้องโดยข้อเท็จจริงว่าไหลมาเท่าไหร่ปล่อยไปเท่านั้นอันนี้ขอให้ภาพอธิบายขอให้ภาพเล่าเรื่อง
And this photo I'd like to show you is from a newspaper. Xayaburi Dam operator tried very hard to explain that inflow is equivalent to the outflow, but the photo might already show you how the change of the river look like at the dam site.
ขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you, Kun Ombun. I think that also highlights the changes are real and they are being exacerbated by projects like Xayaburi Dam. And that example of what happened in July this year, where the testing of the turbines was during a period when the Mekong was experiencing record lows, also highlights how they are prioritizing the project schedules and their interests over considerations of environmental impacts and the people that rely on the river and its resources for their livelihoods. And as we've heard, as Kun Ombun also mentioned, in many ways it's a Thai project. And many projects like this, they do not get off the ground unless there's money and financing to enable that process to go ahead. So our next speaker, Kun Sarini from South Forest, who is also a member of Fair Finance Thailand, will share a bit more about the role of Thai banks in this project.
Hi, so good evening everyone. So aside from coming from a research company, my previous life was a project finance banker. So I used to work at one of the lenders to the Xayaburi project. And so unfortunately, the project finance process hasn't really changed, I think, in the past 20 years. But I think there are some encouraging signs. So I just want to say my talk will be just about two big issues. So the first one is how banks see Xayaburi as a project. And the second one is on some changes that we start to see, and then what we can expect or what we can I think negotiate with the banks to do to improve in the future. So basically, those will be just the two things I want to talk about. So as you already heard from Dr. Kao and Kun Ombun, so this is pretty much financed 100% by Thai banks. And I think in terms of project finance, this kind of project is very attractive Okay, so if you, I think, look at no other considerations aside from financial returns, basically is a 29 or 30 year take or pay power purchase agreement. So banks see this as very low risk in that sense, because essentially as long as the dam produces power as stipulated in the agreement, EGAT, the Thai electricity, will have to buy basically at an agreed upon price, and you can actually forecast it very far ahead in the future. So in comparison, if you just compare this kind of project financing with other project finance, which has much more volatile or fluctuating financial profile, I think that it's very clear which kind of project to go for. So I just want to stress that for a lot of bankers, if you don't take into consideration ESG, the environmental, social, and governance risk, this is basically a no-brainer to an average banker in Thailand. So I think it's also why, as you can see, when new dam or hydropower projects come on the pipeline, one of the first things the banks will expect the borrower is that please produce a PPA. How far are you with the negotiating with the Thai government? So they would say, okay, so as soon as the PPA is signed and is in the format that's very similar to the past, it's almost certain to finance. So another thing that's very, I think, important to note, I would say, and I think this will spell the difference in the future, is that because banks basically look at these projects through the lens of legal, I would say is through the lens of legal compliance, right? So bankers basically, so to put my banker's hat on, we're not environmental experts, we're only experts in financing. So basically if several environmentalists come to us and say, hey, don't you know that these projects have very high environmental risk? We really don't know who to listen to. I think that's a fundamental, I guess, dilemma for bankers. So what they expect is that they would expect that all the regulations and laws and all the paperwork that borrowers have to get before project closing to be an adequate proxy of ESG risk management, right? So in other words, Thai banks would expect that whatever ESG risks are inherent in Xayaburi Dam, those should already have been addressed by the various laws and regulations that are in place. But of course, when you look at the reality, right, it's very different because Xayaburi is quite large. It's also has very strong, many people have already mentioned about transboundary impacts, which were not assessed at all in any of the environmental or social impact assessments, and it wasn't really required anywhere to do transboundary impact assessment. So you can say that this loophole, so even if you look at the project, I think from the strictly legal compliance standpoint, is not enough, right? It's sufficient, this lens is insufficient to address these ESG risks that come from Xayaburi project. So I think this is one thing that banks were not aware. I think many years ago when they started to finance the dam, they were not aware that this project would in many ways would be different from previous dams that they financed in Laos and in other countries. So I think the transboundary impact is one of the key difference. Another one is also, I think, the structure of the MRC, the Mekong River Commission. I think because this is quite a new, in a way, it's a new arrangement. Thai banks did not feel, I think, necessary to engage or to follow the MRC process, directly. They would expect the borrower, which is the Xayaburi project company, to be the one, right? Basically, so they put it in the same box as all the rules and regulations you need to get. So as soon as borrowers say, okay, we have signed everything, the Laos government is okay, banks didn't really see a reason to question. So this, I think, brought me to an interesting point. So many years ago, I had a chance to discuss this project with one of the senior directors of one of the banks. And then I was basically reciting some of the key concerns of civil society and the ESG risk. And he said, actually, when this project came to the table for approval, the board actually was quite aware that there was some, this project is quite different. So we actually added some extra conditions before financing it. And one of those conditions were that the project there has to be no objection from neighboring countries. And so he believed that that's a really good, addition, because that shows that, the bank is aware that, other neighboring countries have to be on board with the project. But then challenge is that, okay, Dr. Kao already mentioned, right, the prior consultation process wasn't never formally concluded. But while the process was not formally concluded, there has been no formal complaints, or like formal objections to the project either by any of the neighboring countries. So I think this is kind of one of the maybe gray areas where if you're a banker, would you decide that, okay, this means that the neighboring countries had some objections, or would you think that, okay, that means as yet there's no objection, so it's okay to go. This is a little bit, I think, of a legal gray area. So I actually asked if the bank would consider commissioning, a legal due diligence on the enforceability of the MRC agreement and all the instruments. And then the answer was, well, we don't think that is necessary at this point. So just as a bit of I guess maybe a background. This is a little bit old information already because this happened many years ago. But I think that is interesting to see anyway how that's the way that banks felt that they already tried to address some of these concerns, right? As for the quality of EIA or the assessment of environmental and social impact assessment, I think banks generally would still rely on what they call lender's advisor, right? And I do agree with many experts who say that there's inherent conflict of interest there, because if you're a lender's advisor, you have an incentive to see the project closed, as soon as possible, and so you may not be very independent when doing your assessments. So I think that this is again a big, I would say, area that needs a lot of improvement. So the question is, how would so-called independent experts, right, be peer-reviewed or addressed, or how would banks, again, if you think from a banker's perspective, how can they tell if among these experts who is more reliable and who to trust? I think this is one of the challenges they still face, which is why a lot more banks nowadays try to adopt external standards to complement their internal project financing process. Because I think inherently they really didn't know who to listen to, or whether, even if they started to believe, okay, maybe we shouldn't listen to our borrower, maybe some of what they say is not correct, but how do we really find credible information? I think this is why a lot of international banks started to seek some outside standards in addition to their own internal processes. And so to that end, I think we start to see some changes in the Thai banks' attitude, right? Maybe it's too slow. I think it may be too slow, but there are some changes. For example, I would say many years ago when Xayaburi project started, a lot of senior bankers, when they were asked about this, they would actually echo the borrowers, right? So they would echo this talk about how it's a run-of-the-river dam, how all the impacts would already be properly managed, and they would say, we already thought of the precautions and all of that. So it's a little bit of a kind of very much the same stance as the borrower, right? But I think in the past 1 or 2 years, especially just recently, there was a Bangkok Sustainable Banking Forum hosted by the Bank of Thailand in August. So K-Bank, Kasikorn Bank, and Siam Commercial Bank, two of the big lenders on this project, were there on stage. And there actually was a question asked from the audience about Xayaburi Dam. And the answer, I think, is very different. So the senior bankers no longer say that, we already take all the precautions, we believe that our borrower is complying with everything. Instead, the executives actually conceded that maybe we need to look at more standards when we lend to hydropower projects. And another senior banker said, I'm not sure if the drought, that's actually Kun Ombun talked about a bit, so we're not sure if the drought is related or how it's related to the dam or not. It's a little bit of a controversy, but we need to look into it. So I think that's already, you may think, this is really not saying much, right? But I would say that's already different from saying that, okay, we believe what the borrower says. So I think this is a bit of a move in the right direction. Also, two of these same banks, the K-Bank and the SCB, have recently announced that they are adopting the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is, very maybe a high-level set of principles, guidance on business and human rights. But the fact that they already announced that they are adopting it, that means that it remains to be seen on the implementation. And so when I talk to the credit departments of both banks, they say that they are now actually thinking of ways to implement the guiding principles. They are thinking of how to draft the credit policies, especially the sector guidelines, to comply with the guiding principles. They also mentioned at the same event, the Bangkok Sustainable Banking Forum, the Thai Bankers Association announced the so-called responsible lending guidelines, which is not really guidelines yet, it's just a high-level kind of a guide to writing guidelines. But actually in that document, all the banks have adopted, and that actually spelled out that the banks have to engage with stakeholders. So I think that that's at least an instrument where banks can no longer deny that they have to look at more standards and look at outsiders view, and they have to engage more closely with stakeholders of the borrowers. Because, for example, if you take the UNGP, one of the principles clearly says that companies have to be responsible in their supply chain, and they have to implement grievance mechanisms at the level where the impact is most likely to occur. So I think that's some encouraging news. So I think, of course, it remains to be seen how true the banks are to their word, but I think the fact that they already announced this adoption, the fact that there's already responsible lending guidelines, it means that they cannot turn back. So I think the key critical issue here is how to show them that your experience with Xayaburi is really a good example of how legal compliance alone is really not enough. It's really a good example of how not to do the project, and how you can improve that by adhering to the UNGP and the relevant industry standards. So I think that's kind of my little summary so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Kun Sarini, for sharing some of your insights of the Thai banks. And I think it also highlights with some of these shifts and pointing to some of those shifts in attitudes and public statements and commitments, that also presents opportunities for researchers, advocates and consumers of banks in Thailand and beyond, and to also draw on the experience, as Kun Sirini mentioned, of Xayaburi about what not to do when you're looking at considering financing for particular types of projects. What sort of issues should you look at and consider before making your decision? Xayaburi is a dam on the Mekong River. The last couple of speakers spoke about the sort of from a Thai angle, but it's a river that's shared by 6 countries in this region, and its waters and sediments nourishes other parts of this basin and region. And our next speaker is Professor Le Antoine from the Research Institute for Climate Change in Cantor University, who has been for a long time, actively engaged in researching issues related to climate change, environment, water resources in the Mekong Delta. So he will share some of his perspectives.
Thank you.
Please.
Good evening, everybody. Today I'm very delighted to be here, and thanks International River invite me to come here and we had a chance to speak about the impact of Xayaburi and the Mekong Dam mainstream dam to environmental livelihood and development in the Mekong River Delta in Vietnam. I'm working for Research Institute of Climate Change of Cantor University, and we try to work with many different stakeholders in the Mekong Delta, including the government and community, for building the healthy ecosystem and sustainable river in a changing climate. As you know, the Mekong Delta is very low and flat, and it's affected strongly by the climate change. In the last two or three decades, we found that the sea level impact to the delta, and combined with the high temperature and abnormal rainfall, including and all the impact like the flood and droughts, impact to the livelihood of the local people in summer. Besides, we also found that the mainstream dam in the Mekong leading the delta sinking and swelling. And based on some research of the MSCs, we found that in present years, in present years, the sediment from the mainstream of the Mekong River come to the delta is still 85 ton in the years. Is compared to many years before, we receive about 160 ton of the sediment. Okay, continue. All right. As you see in the picture, climate change and sea level rise is considered as one of the biggest challenges of the Mekong Delta. And we found that based on the many different research from scientific agencies like the ISAM or DSI or Vietnam Mekong River Commission, we found that the sediment is reduced about 50% compared to 160 ton of the sediment many years before. It will affect strongly to the delta. Combined with the climate change and water temporary issue, we found that there's many change of the water resources in Mekong Delta, not only in the water quality, but also quantity and water dynamics and water for ecosystem. It's lead to many pollutants of the water, ground and flood, and saline intrusion, and it's also affect to the many the fish source and nutrient source. Of course, it will affect strongly to the food security and health problem of the local people here, because we are in the end part of the Mekong River. We found in the year 2018, we found that in the Mekong Delta there's more than 390 erosion ponds and more than 581 kilometers of the erosion land in the riverbank and coastal lines. And we found that the erosion rate in the Mekong Delta is about 1 or 2 to 20 meters per year. And each year we lost about 500 to 550 hectares of the land. It's very serious now. This is a picture taken in the cap of the Mekong Delta. Is the Kamau cap. Many years before, when we come here to take this picture, we can see the many mangrove forests were destroyed by the sea level rise and the lack of the sediment deposits in the Kamau Peninsula. And this is the last house still in the cap of the Kamau. And in the last year, when I returned to this place, this house will disappear, and I don't know exactly where they are now. And in the last time we had informed that recently a Vietnamese state-owned company named the PC Power Company intend to participate in the Luang Prabang hydro power project as an investor with a capital contribution ratio about 38%. It's really a shock news to me, and why the Vietnamese government has always expressed the concern about the impact of the hydropower on the Mekong mainstream to the Mekong Delta. Personally, I think this is the action that Vietnam shortened itself the foot of the Lao dams, and I think this is more serious to the Mekong Delta, and as the Vietnam River Network has expressed about the construction of the Luang Prabang, and you can access to this website for the full press release. The Vietnam River Network has proposed the Petro Vietnam Power Corporation and authority from the government to consider is the invest of the Luang Prabang hydro power project in the Laos. In present time, we found that at least 6 water environmental risks to the Mekong Delta: climate change and sea level rise, upstream hydropower, increase of population and migration of the people, change of the land use and over-exploiting the natural resources, including sand, marine, and groundwater attraction, and the decrease of the soil, water, and air. I think we can try. The local people in the Mekong Delta can find some ways. Although it's rather costly for adaptation with climate change and sea level rise, we can prevent the increase of the population and migration, control the natural resources exploitation, adjustable of the changing of the land use. But concerning the upstream hydropower dam, I don't know how to control and adapt with the water regime change in the upstream to the Mekong Delta. I think the Lup Prabang and other planned hydropower dam in the mainstream of the Mekong River must be cancelled. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Tuan, for highlighting the situation in the Mekong Delta and what some of the risks, in addition to climate change and developments that are happening within the Mekong Delta itself, but also developments that are happening upstream, such as the Mekong mainstream dams, and how that has implications for people and the economy of the Mekong Delta. Our next speaker is Maureen Harris, who's the Southeast Asia Program Director of International Rivers. Over to you, Maureen.
Thanks, Gary. So previous speakers have introduced a lot of background on the Xayaburi project, and including the contested and in many ways flawed decision-making process. One of the outcomes of that decision-making process was a redesign of the Xayaburi project and a much touted additional $400 million which were invested in the redesign. Earlier this year, while the full redesign has not been released by the project developer, earlier this year the MRC released a review report on the design changes. And International Rivers is sharing a new report today, which is an expert commentary on the review of these design changes, on the MRC's review. The MRC's review looks at the adequacy of the project developer's information submitted about the redesign. And the comments, the analysis looks not just at the project itself, but also the implications for these changes around the broader decision-making process itself, and the way in which the project unfolded through that decision-making process. The expert commentary, so we've asked two experts who have provided input to this commentary. There are two people, Dr. Philip Hirsch and Dr. Oliver Hensengirth, who have been following the Xayaburi project for a long time, since the early stages. And what they've provided is not a critique of the MRC review, which contains some strong analysis, but drawing out some key points from that analysis to help us understand some of the gaps and deficiencies in the project redesign itself and in the information available about the effectiveness of those design measures, but also about what the implications of this is for broader regional cooperation, and including on subsequent projects which have followed Xayaburi. So the focus of the first part of the expert commentary focuses on the Xayaburi design itself, and it looks at particular aspects of the MRC review, in particular the environmental impacts. So focused on the changes to the design that were related to the fish passage and sediment transport. And it's organised at looking at three areas. One is the design effectiveness of those measures. Another is the adequacy of the data and information provided. And a third is the monitoring and operating rules for the project, which will then affect the effectiveness, will go into the effectiveness of the mitigation measures in mitigating impacts on the river system. And then the second part of the commentary looks in particular at the implications for regional cooperation. In relation to the design effectiveness, there's quite a bit of detail in there, so I can't in the time available go into detail, but I just want to draw out some key points. The commentary highlights that there's many unknowns, ongoing unknowns in the effectiveness of the mitigation measures, and particularly with respect to the fish species and the particular ecological conditions in the Mekong. So things like there are still many unknowns about how the design will be responsive to the very high volume of fish species in the Mekong, how it will be effective for different kinds of species and different flow conditions, and these sorts of issues. A key point around the design effectiveness that is highlighted also in the MRC review is that nowhere in the world have these measures yet been tested or monitored. So Xayaburi is in effect being used as an experimental test case for the effectiveness of these measures in the context of the Mekong, in the particular ecological and biodiversity context of the Mekong. And this contravenes one of the key recommendations of the Strategic Environmental Assessment on Mekong Mainstream Dams, which was alluded to by other speakers and issued in 2010, which said that the Mekong mainstream should never be used as a test case for proving and improving full dam hydropower technologies. The expert commentary report looks at issues, lack of adequate data and information provided by the project developer. And notes that there's no information was provided on key aspects of the design still, so the information was incomplete. As well as the monitoring studies which are being conducted by the developer to ensure that the project is operated in a way and the design is effective for mitigating impacts. So an example of this is that monitoring studies for different fish species have not been provided, and how these monitoring studies have been used to inform the design of the fish passage. And so this means that effectively the developers are asking the MRC and all the other stakeholders in the basin to take their word for it that studies are being done and that these have been used to inform the design. Another issue is differences of opinion between the developers' data and opinions of scientific experts, including MRC expertise. And one example of this is differences around the proportion of sediment load in terms of fine sediment versus coarse sediment. And so this has implications. The developers' assumptions about sediment load mean that much more sediment would be passed through the dam compared to independent experts. There's also lack of data specifically around social impacts and transboundary impacts, which is significant given that these are key concerns around the impacts of the project on food security and livelihoods. And the third aspect is around the monitoring and operating rules for the project, which are included in the project concession agreement and the power purchase agreement. Like other Mekong mainstream dams, for Xayaburi, the provisions of these agreements are confidential, so they're hidden in commercial in confidence requirements, so they can't be known and they weren't available to the MRC in their review. And this is important because mitigation effectiveness relies on knowing about the dam operations and how the dam operations could be adjusted, such as changing flow regimes to enable optimum fish migration, or to pass sediment. And it also means that requirements for adaptive management or changes to the operation of the dam while it's in operation, based on ongoing monitoring of impacts, are constrained by the terms of the power purchase agreement and the concession agreement, while these are not transparent and not made public. And this is concerning because there are some indications already in the design information submitted by the project developers that the priority in the design is still maximizing power generation over mitigation. So one example is limitations on adjusting the flow regimes for fish because this would impact the power generation of the project. So a conclusion is around the effectiveness of the mitigation measures and the investment in the mitigation measures is that spending a lot of money does not guarantee effectiveness. And the developer's own advance claims that the mitigation measures will be effective do not themselves guarantee effectiveness. So the second part of the review looks more widely at the decision-making process and the implications for regional cooperation. It examines some of the flaws in the prior consultation process, which have already been touched on by some of the other speakers, including the fact that the Xayaburi EIA wasn't made available during prior consultation, and there wasn't a regional stakeholder consultation process. As others have mentioned, there was also no agreement between the Lower Mekong members around how to proceed with the project. And this lack of agreement is in effect ongoing. There's been no resolution as the MRC review recognised. The process itself of Xayaburi is a lesson in that it highlights the weakness of the MRC in its ability to coordinate regional planning and the fact that this is dependent on the will of individual member states to enable it to effectively take this role, and we've seen this play out in subsequent projects. There's also limitations from the Xayaburi decision-making experience or process around the timeliness and sequencing of information. So for example, the MRC's review of the compliance report that Carl referred to, conducted by Pori, had recommended that further studies are needed and that these should be undertaken prior to the dam moving forward and not parallel to construction. But that review of the compliance report itself was released a year late and well into after the project construction had already started. So in it itself, it's an example of the way in which lack of transparent information has also constrained the ability to have constructive debate about the project. Another key outcome of the Xayaburi decision-making process was agreement to undertake the council study, again as mentioned by some of the other speakers. And the council study findings highlight really significant basin-wide impacts, including, as Dr. Duan mentioned, around the amount of sediment reaching the delta and really significant reduction in fisheries if all of the planned projects go ahead. But the council study was also released only last year after 7 years in the development and close to, when the Xayaburi Dam and also the Donsahong Dam were by that stage already close to completion. So too late to inform decision-making over individual projects. Other speakers have also alluded to the lack of accountability that is evidenced or revealed by the Xayaburi decision-making process, as seen in the ongoing lawsuit filed by Thai villages, which was initially filed in 2012 and initially dismissed by the lower court, but in 2014 the Supreme Court accepted jurisdiction for the lawsuit despite the fact that the project was in Laos and recognised the likelihood of transboundary impacts in Thailand. But despite that decision, the lawsuit itself and the remedies being asked for by Thai communities still have not seen resolution. And other complaints, such as using the OECD guidelines, the Thai Human Rights Commission, have still not delivered tangible results in the form of accountability or remedy for affected communities. And this is despite the factors, as we've seen and as we've heard from other speakers, of impacts now being felt, with the example of the water level and drought conditions in July, and the fact that this coincided with the testing operations of Xayaburi. So looking forward to subsequent projects, and including the Luang Prabang Dam, Luang Prabang is the fifth dam, will be the fifth dam to undergo the prior consultation process through the MRC. And that prior consultation process is also beginning this month. From Xayaburi onwards through the other projects, which we don't have time to discuss in detail, but although we've seen some improvements and some reforms from the MRC in terms of information released earlier, in terms of holding regional consultation meetings, fundamental flaws are still being seen consistently with each of these processes. And some of those flaws include inadequate information, inadequate studies to inform the process, which then inhibits meaningful input and participation into the process, as well as the inability to address the issue of disagreement between countries about how projects should proceed. While the Council study's findings send a strong message on the risks of proceeding with additional mainstream dams, there's still lack of clarity from the Lower Mekong governments about taking up and formally endorsing these findings. So only Vietnam has made statements so far formally endorsing some of the Council study findings. And the Council study itself has instead highlighted the lack of effective basin-wide hydropower development mechanism to address some of the trade-offs and consider alternative pathways. So still decision-making is proceeding at a project-by-project level rather than at the basin-wide level to look at pathways and possibilities going forward on the Mekong. The Luang Prabang Dam also raises similar questions around accountability to people within the basin. Dr. Tuan talked about the Vietnamese investment in the project and the involvement of a Vietnamese state-owned company, which stands at odds with the Vietnamese government's positions within the prior consultation process for previous mainstream projects. And given the likelihood of significant impacts on the Delta, raises similar questions around accountability, potentially including legal accountability, as we've seen with Xayaburi. The review report, the commentary report, makes some recommendations going forward about how some of the impacts could be better internalized into the cost of projects through better design processes. So including things such as greater transparency and peer review in design, conducting baseline studies, ensuring that developers and independent scientific analysis are brought together, and ensuring that there is requirements for adaptive management and adaptive operations included in concession agreements and power purchase agreements. There's also recommendations around regional decision making and the fact that there needs to be a shift from an ongoing emphasis on a top-down planning approach to decision making to one that is much more participatory and involving meaningful stakeholder engagement from within the basin. And the Council study also, as one of the key recommendations, recommended, given the impacts predicted through the findings, that alternatives need to be assessed. And that globally and regionally, the price of solar and wind energy is rapidly becoming cost competitive. And there's huge potential for this in the region. And so alternative pathways to the current development plans for hydropower exist. And a comprehensive options assessment is needed to fully assess and understand these alternatives and to include them in decision-making processes. So just to conclude with a quote from the commentary from Dr. Oliver Hensengirth, that a large dam is not just a piece of infrastructure to produce energy, so it also changes power relationships. And in the case of Xayaburi, we can think of the project as not just a dam, but also as a set of relationships. And through the decision-making process and how it has played out, how it has altered relationships in the region, people's relationship with the Mekong River, people's relationship with the environment more broadly, and relationships between people in the basin, between affected communities, farming and fishing communities, and decision makers. And looking forward, thinking about these relationships, what kind of relationships does the region want to produce in terms of contributing to a development path that is sustainable for all of the people in the basin? Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. We do have a few copies of the expert commentary on the design review for those that are interested. We're now going to open up the floor for some question and answer. And yes, a lot of the attention, and we looked at the issues through the lens of Xayaburi project, as it was and is the first mainstream dam to be built and to start operating in the lower part of the Mekong River. But as we've heard from all the panelists, this has had not only impacts but implications on a number of levels. We heard about already direct adverse impacts that are being felt by communities in Thailand downstream, which extend hundreds of kilometers from where the dam is located. We heard the risks that it's posing for the people in the economy of the Mekong Delta that is already facing threats from rising sea level, salinity, climate change, and which is being compounded by Xayaburi Dam and other dams that are planned or under construction in the Mekong. As Carl also mentioned, Xayaburi did pave the way for other projects to go through such a process, and there has been 4 mainstream dams that have started the prior consultation process since the Xayaburi Dam. There are also implications and rethinking of what does this mean for different aspects of planning and decision making. We heard that there are also opportunities looking forward with, for example, some of the Thai banks, their views in terms of that's reflected in some of their public commitments and policies does signify some shifts, and that does present opportunities to try and translate some of those commitments into more meaningful practices that do better consider people's voices, the environment, and some of the environmental and social governance risks involved in project financing beyond a legal compliance point of view. So I'd like to open up the floor for any questions or brief comments that people may have to any of the panelists here. Please don't be shy.
I'm not, yeah.
Oh, there is someone. Yes.
Yeah. Peter Jansen, Asia Times. I'm not sure who to address this to, maybe Maureen, since you talked about this a little bit. Maybe you can clarify the status of the litigation underway. I'm a little unclear. There seems to be one case in Thailand, directed in Thailand, and you know, if you talk to the electricity producer, the Lao Electricity Authority, they say no way in heck this is ever going to go through, and they're not concerned about this litigation at all. And I wonder if the panel has any sort of judgment on whether or not this has a chance to ever stop this project from proceeding. Number 2, you know, a lot of the potential damage, environmental, fisheries, etc., is the jury is still out on that, right? I mean, we don't know. Will this fish ladder work? Will it fail? Will the sedimentation increase or decrease? You know, probably we won't know the effect of this, the impact of this dam, until like 10 years from now or something. At that stage, where does the litigation stand? I mean, are there any sort of samples in other parts of the world where you have basically a failure to collaborate on stopping a dam that might, or a project that has some downstream impact on other countries that, you know, I just don't know the international law implications. Is there some sort of accountability in terms of litigation that we might see 5-10 years from now? Maybe Vietnam gets a little bit pissed off, yeah? And I don't know, who would you file a case against? Against Chow Koh Chang, against the Thai banks, against the Lao government? I mean, where do you go from this? Huh?
I can start with some responses, and then also if there's others on the panel who'd like to share as well. About a little bit more on the status of the Xayaburi litigation, because I touched on it quite briefly. But so the case was initially filed in the lower court in 2012, and was dismissed by the lower court on jurisdictional grounds, including because the project was located in Laos, so questions over whether a Thai court had jurisdiction over that project. An appeal was made then to the Thai Supreme Administrative Court, which was successful in 2014. The court issued a decision finding that the Thai court did have jurisdiction over the project, and also recognising within that decision that the project was likely to have transboundary impacts on communities in Thailand. The court then sent the case back to the lower court to decide on the merits of the case, and the case was again dismissed. And a second appeal was made to the Thai Supreme Administrative Court, I believe in 2016, and that is still pending a decision. So the case is currently still before the Thai Supreme Court on a decision. In terms of stopping the project, the lawsuit challenges the decision-making process for the power purchase agreement by the Thai state agencies responsible for approving the power purchase. So in the communities in the lawsuit are asking that process be redone to meet requirements and to respect community rights, including under the Thai constitution. So for consultation, and they're also asking for a transboundary impact assessment. Kun Ombun might want to share more about what the communities hope to get out of that process. In terms of legal options later down the track, the Mekong Agreement does not have a dispute resolution function, but it does link to dispute resolution functions within international law, including within ASEAN. But that would be a state-to-state dispute resolution. So if there's a state-to-state dispute that's escalated, then international legal jurisdiction can apply, and for example the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, which is responsible for disputes between states. But that wouldn't be, that's not a mechanism that affected communities, for example, can directly access. So other forms of lawsuits and litigation may be possible, but depending on which actors you're talking about, which jurisdictions you're talking about, that's something that perhaps needs further exploration. But as you say, the impacts are not something, and evidence for those impacts are not something that may be fully felt until some years into the future.
ในเรื่องของมาตรการบรรเทาผลกระทบเนี่ยจำเป็นอย่างยิ่งที่จะต้องมีการศึกษาเรื่องนี้อย่างชัดในห่วงหลายปีที่ผ่านมาเนี่ยพี่น้องชาวบ้านก็ได้เก็บข้อมูลว่าเคยพึ่งพาแม่น้ำโขงเคยหายปลาได้เท่าไหร่แล้วเมื่อปัจจุบันเนี่ยปลามันหายไปขนาดไหนแต่สิ่งที่เราเห็นชัดๆเนี่ยก็คือว่าทั้งในเรื่องประเด็นอื่นๆที่มีปัญหาทั้งเรื่องการเกษตรเรื่องตลิ่งพังการสูญเสียดินแดนเรื่องของการประปาที่หลายหน่วยงานเนี่ยจะต้องวางแผนเพื่อแก้ไขปัญหาเรื่องนี้เยอะมากเฉพาะองค์การบริหารส่วนจังหวัดหนองคายเมื่อวานก็ได้ใช้รถแมคโครในการขุดบ่อในกลางแม่น้ำโขงกว่า20บ่อตัวเลขเหล่านี้ต้องมีการประเมินต้องมีการศึกษาถึงจะบอกได้ว่ามาตรการในการบรรเทาผลกระทบและเยียวยาเนี่ยคืออะไรแต่ท้ายที่สุดพี่น้องแม่น้ำโขงเนี่ยไม่ได้คาดหวังในเรื่องของตัวเงินว่าจะต้องเท่านั้นเท่านี้เราต้องการแม่น้ำโขงที่อุดมสมบูรณ์ของเรากลับคืนมาเพราะฉะนั้นแม่น้ำโขงไม่ใช่ห้องทดลองชัยบุรีควรจะหยุดที่นี่แล้วก็ทบทวนเขื่อนตัวต่อไปค่ะ
On mitigation measure, there is a need for a study to be able to explain and design the mitigation measure. The villagers along the Mekong River already conduct their own research, collecting information about fish catch, fish loss, as well as impacts on other aspects, as well as such as riverbank erosion, riverbank garden. Yesterday, Nong Khai provincial government already used a backhoe truck to dig more than 20 ponds on the bank of the Mekong River in order to get water supply to the town. So for me, I would say that we don't need any compensation, we don't need any catch, but we need our Mekong River back. And I'd like to say that the Xayaburi Dam should be the last dam to be built and need the impact mitigation measure immediately.
Just very quickly, one other thing I forgot to mention, meant to mention, was that the Xayaburi lawsuit is not the only one, so it's also helped pave the way for a subsequent lawsuit. There's also a lawsuit in the Thai Administrative Court challenging the Pak Beng's prior consultation process in Thailand, and so that lawsuit was also filed before a power purchase agreement was signed, and there still hasn't been confirmation of a power purchase in Thailand regarding the Pak Beng project.
So, I'm just going to add a little bit. This is not about litigation per se, but just so that, just going back to the UNGP, the United Nations Guiding Principles. So the Thai government, there's a cabinet resolution, I think twice, even in the past 3 years, that specifically said that Thai companies who invest overseas have to take into account the United Nations Guiding Principles on business and human rights. And I think this was adopted after the Midpon company, the case of the sugarcane plantation in Cambodia, which was raised to the Human Rights Commission of Thailand, and then they proposed this to the cabinet. So that's kind of one development. I think that should be hopefully opening up some doors for at least some grievance mechanisms and access to remedy. Another similar development is that now the Stock Exchange of Thailand and the Securities Exchange Commission, the Stock Exchange regulator, has signed. The Stock Exchange the Stock Exchange Commission (SEC) has signed an MOU with the Human Rights Commission of Thailand on implementing the UNGP for listed companies. And so the parent company of Xayaburi Chaw Kan Chang is a listed company in Thailand. So the SEC is now considering very seriously how to amend their disclosure, both the disclosure regulations and the filing regulations, to take into account the UNGP. So I think this would be something to look forward to, and this hopefully should come into force sometime next year. So there'll be some new, hopefully, disclosure requirements or filing requirements for listed firms to comply with. So I think this is something to I think keep in mind. And of course, banks are all listed companies also on a stock exchange.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Henrietta. I'm an independent consultant. I missed the first part of the presentation, so I apologize if I'm asking a question that's already been addressed. I sort of have two questions. One is to Kun Sarani. I was really interested and happy to hear about how Thai banks are using the UN umbrella guidelines. And I'm wondering whether you can speak a little bit more to the performance standards that these Thai banks might be adopting. I know, for example, IFC, International Finance Corporation, the World Bank performance standards are increasingly being adopted by both regional and national banks in their lending. So I'm wondering whether you can speak to that. And then to Maureen, I have the question about the process of this expert commentary. I mean, I have a copy. I'm really looking forward to reading it. But I'm interested to what extent the experts who were involved in this commentary actually did any stakeholder consultation themselves. That's really it. So if you could address those two questions, I'd appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So the Thai banks, I think generally they are aware of the Equator Principles. So this was actually heavily promoted, I think, by the IFC a few years ago in Thailand. I think at that time, the general idea that I got from talking to bankers is that they are reluctant to adopt Equator Principles because it would imply a lot of, to them, basically the two parts essentially to the Equator Principle, right? So one, it essentially requires more review. So banks have either have to hire environmental experts to sit in the bank, or they have to have some external function to perform the additional review on risky projects. And then the second component is the disclosure requirements, right? So banks have to then disclose the projects that they use the equator principles. And I think the general consensus I got at that time was that they're actually quite reluctant on the second bit, on the disclosure bit, because they're afraid, oh, is this going to be, for example, revealing some confidential information on their clients? So, and so they're kind of, while they sort of see the benefits of, having more eyes or more kind of more varied views on the project, they're, I think, reluctant to adopt the entire package of the equator principles as is. And I think that's why they have taken the choice of kind of, speaking to each other basically and announcing the sort of the domestic, you could say, domestic responsible lending guidelines. I think this is because they feel that they have more control in a way over the process. So if anyone is interested, this document I mentioned is publicly available on the Thai Bankers Association website. It's a very short 5-page document, and again, it's a very high level, guide to drafting guidelines, but at least it actually says that, banks have this responsibility and they have to assign, bankers to be accountable for this. They have to engage with wide range of stakeholders. And so that it's at least a starting point. So I think anyone who, going forward, definitely we can use this as a way of saying that, okay, so we can help you implement then these guidelines, and here's what you need to do when you look at the hydropower sector. So I think hopefully that document will open doors to some more, I would say, concrete set of guidelines. I don't think any Thai bank at this point will go and adopt, something like the Equator Principles, which is like a really kind of, to them, a big package of international standard, but they will start by slowly, gradually developing, more and more concrete set of guidelines. And I think the UNGP is kind of an interesting starting point in that regard, because at least banks can see that as a responsibility of their borrowers. So my adopting guidelines means that then I can go and tell my borrowers that this is what we have to do, and then we can sort of take a more kind of supervising approach to see whether borrowers are following that. So I think, I don't know, so I think this is maybe hopefully the way, but definitely I believe that you will see more concrete guidelines around these issues in the next 1-2 years. And of course the hope, I think, of civil society is that how to basically get in front of the issues, right? And convince banks to say that you need to develop hydropower sector credit policy and a credible one to help address the gaps and to fill up the void left by basically your legal compliance is no longer enough. And so I think I see this as an opportunity, but I think the civil society has to be very precise also and really engage using their public commitments and these tools. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. For the process for the expert commentary, we didn't, there wasn't a process for stakeholder engagement or stakeholder input into the expert commentary. However, we did reach out to experts who are people who have been doing research on the Xayaburi Dam and on the Mekong for a long time and had monitored the early stages of the decision-making process, going back years. And at that time, that included input from people in the basin, from stakeholders. So they drew on that expertise and their sort of long history of research to provide input into the implications of this particular MRC review. But it's a good question, and without making any commitments, I think going forward, one thing that would be interesting would be to look at the implications out of this review, and then also some of the research by Thai communities that Kun Ombon mentioned, looking at local impacts and collecting information on local impacts and how these tally together. So maybe something for us to look at going forward. Thanks.
Sorry, I know I'm probably not meant to, but if I could add just one more comment in response to that. In terms of that monitoring, and it links to the sort of partly in response to the first question around how do we know the damages. So there are initiatives that are currently underway through the Mekong River Commission where they want to pilot what's called joint environmental monitoring, which will be piloted at 2 of the mainstream dams, so Don Sahong, which is another one in southern Laos, and Xayaburi Dam. But to date, that's been a very sort of technical process and in some of our discussions and advocacy with Mekong River Commission and others is how do you make that more transparent, more open, that's inclusive of community research and community experiences as well as being a rigorous process. So that's still hopefully is still subject to discussion and debate, but I think it does highlight, and it's also highlighted in both the MRC's own review of the design, but also pointed out in this commentary around whose data counts and what are some of the assumptions. And by having a more transparent and independent process, getting that information out and debated would actually lead to a better process rather than each different group drawing on their own source of data but not engaging with each other. So.
Just as a follow-up, who actually, was this an international rivers sort of initiative, or was international rivers approached by the MRC, or how did this expert commentary come to life?
It was an international rivers initiative.
Yeah.
The MRC did not ask us to provide the commentary on their review. But we felt it was important and selected these experts who had given their experience, their long experience looking at this project and also at other hydropower developments in the Mekong to bring that to bear on the implications of the MRC's own review, which has really important information and analysis as well, but in terms of what this means both for the project but also for subsequent projects and the processes of decision making.
I'd just like to comment a little bit on this discussion because I think that these types of reports are very important. I think if you actually think about the way the expert knowledge is produced, the accountability of that knowledge between experts requires this type of debate. So I think personally this is precisely the sort of report that should be published to encourage further discussion going forward.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes, Dominique?
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Dominic Fulder, Nikkei Asian Review. We're talking about a dam that caused a problem before it even functioned. That was during a test period a few months back. It was accused of being implicated. There was also a dam in China. Could you, in lay terms, give a description of the doomsday scenario when this thing actually starts functioning? What is the worst damage it could do? Second thing is, if it's found to be an environmental catastrophe, and I wouldn't be waiting for the Thai court system to affirm that, but if it is found to be a disaster, what can be done to stop it functioning? Who has the power to put it into reverse? And could it be dismantled if it was that bad? As we discussed, we know that there are more dams in the pipeline, so this is going to be an amplified problem if it's as bad as some people suspect. Thank you.
Who would like to answer that?
Thank you for the question. In terms of the impacts of this project, as we've been discussing, it's difficult to exactly quantify what the impacts will be, given the gaps in knowledge and information around the mitigation measures and around the design of the project itself. But we do know from the information that we have, and including some of the input into the expert commentary mentions this as well as the MRC's review, that the impacts are likely to be very significant on particularly fish passage through the project, as well as blocking sediment. The figures differ. One in the expert commentary, it talks about one of the predictions based on MRC data. It could be that the project blocks up to 50%. The Xayaburi alone blocks up to 50% of the sediment load that's travelling downstream. So that's very significant in terms of downstream impacts, including and on top of already impacts that have been seen on the river for blocking of sediment flows from China's upstream dams on the Lansang, and will contribute to some of these very serious impacts on the Mekong Delta that we've heard about from Dr. Tuan. Also around fish passage, we know that there's very rich biodiversity of species, including in this stretch of the Mekong. There's important iconic fish species, that is such as the Mekong giant catfish, which is very unlikely to be able to pass the fish passage measures in the Xayaburi project. So what we do know is that impacts on the species and the volume, the mass of fish in the river will be seriously impacted by the project. We don't know quite how much, because we don't know how many species and which species might be able to pass the design, the fish passage design. But it's still, nonetheless, even if some species can, it's likely to have very significant impacts on the fish in the river and change the composition of the types of fish that do survive. And this then, again, has significant social impacts for people's food security downstream, for their livelihoods, but also for their ways of life and their traditional knowledge, which have built up over generations around understanding the patterns of the species in the river and the ecological patterns of the river system, which will be very much changed through the development of Xayaburi project as well as other dams.
I think there's many scientific documents approved that's the impact of the hydropower dam to the delta. We can refer some report from ISAM or DSI or Vietnam Mekong River Commission. 2 years before, the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources of the Vietnam had to pay $4 million for a big research of the impact of the hydropower dam to the Mekong Delta. And we found many serious problem about this. And of course, we continue to monitor the impact in order to improve the mathematical model of the different aspects about this. And I think in present, the higher ranking authorities of the Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam should sit together and review and revise the Mekong River Mekong Agreement 1995, because from 1995 up to now is more than 24 years, and up to now there's no any review about this. And maybe we can sign another agreement with more strict rules on water sharing and benefit sharing also. And besides, we're also thinking about how to find another option for energy problem in the Mekong Delta, like develop the renewable energy for the Laos, and all the country can buy the electricity from the renewable energy, from the solar energy or wind and energy, also another alternative for solving the problem in the Mekong region. Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting question that's raised, and I think aside from the impacts themselves, it's also a question of distribution as well. So in other words, which particular groups are more at risk. So if you look at the Xayaburi projects, it's quite clear that some countries' national economies more than others will benefit, and some potentially face harm to their national economies. So even at the national government level, we can identify winners and losers between countries. But then I think more clear is between actors in society, between companies that are proponents and financiers that fund, versus communities that face risk from the project but little benefit. So I think we also need to talk about how risk is being distributed and whether that is fair as well when we talk about these issues. Thank you.
ดิฉันขอพูดในนามผู้ได้รับผลกระทบ ถ้าจะพูดถึงประโยคเมื่อกี้ว่าเราได้ตัดสินเขื่อนก่อนที่จะมีการสร้างเขื่อนอีกเนี่ยเป็นคำพูดที่เรารู้สึกสะเทือนใจเพราะว่าสิ่งที่พี่น้องชาวบ้านอยู่ท่ามกลางความวิตกกังวลยังมีอีกหลายประเด็นเยอะแยะมากมายมากที่ไม่ได้พูดถ้าจะเคารพสิทธิมนุษยชนกันเนี่ยต้องยึดถือเรื่องหลักของการปกป้องการคุ้มครองการเยียวยาถ้าภาษาไทยก็คือวัวหายล้อมคอกสิ่งที่เรากังวลแล้วก็ยังไม่ได้พูดถึงเราไม่ปรารถนาที่จะเห็นชีวิตใดชีวิตหนึ่งที่เกิดขึ้นเหมือนกรณีเขื่อนเซเปียนเซน้ำน้อยแตกผู้ศึกษาเขื่อนไม่เคยบอกว่าเขื่อนจะแตกแต่ถ้าไปดูข้อมูลว่าเขื่อนแตกทั่วโลกมีกี่แห่งเราจะพบข้อมูลเยอะมากสิ่งเหล่านี้ทำไมต้องให้เราอยู่ในสภาพที่มันแบบกลัวกังวลจะรอให้มันสิ่งเหล่านี้เกิดขึ้นแล้วก็ใช้ชีวิตของผู้คนในแม่น้ำโขงเนี่ยเป็นห้องทดลองกันนั้นหรือตรงนี้ฝากประเด็นที่ชัดเจนว่ากำไรที่เกิดจากการสร้างเขื่อนเนี่ยมันเข้ากระเป๋าใครพลังงานทางเลือกมีเยอะแยะเราไม่ได้ปฏิเสธพลังงานแต่เราเสนอให้มีพลังงานทางเลือกอื่นที่สามารถที่จะซัพพอร์ตตรงนี้ได้ไหมประเด็นนี้เป็นประเด็นที่พี่น้องริมโขงห่วงและกังวลโดยเฉพาะเขื่อนหลวงพระบางที่ตั้งอยู่บนลอยเลื่อนซึ่งแผ่นดินจะไหวตอนไหนก็ไม่ทราบเราจะตายตอนไหนก็ไม่รู้ระบบสัญญาณการเตือนภัยคืออะไรแผนการอพยพคืออะไรเรื่องราวเหล่านี้เนี่ยแม้กระทั่งรัฐไทยเองยังไม่มีแผนสักหน่วยงานที่จะสร้างความมั่นใจให้กับพี่น้องในพื้นที่ชาวบ้านว่าเราจะอยู่อย่างไรในท่ามกลางสถานการณ์ที่แบบเขื่อนมันเยอะแยะขนาดนี้
On behalf of affected people on the Mekong River, when I heard about how decision making was made, I felt very hurt. If we're looking through the human rights lens, I would say that we don't need mitigation, but we need prevention. Our life has been in risk, under risk. We have seen experience from the Sapien Se Nam Noi. No one told affected communities that there is potential for seismic and on the earthquake and dam collapse. We don't want to see this kind of thing anymore. And there are many, many cases around the world. Our life has been posed to this difficult situation without us participating in decision making. Now the Mekong River is used as a testing ground. Profits is going to whose pockets while we are paying all this risk by our life? There are many alternative energies available. How can we consider those alternatives? And we living below downstream of the Xayaburi Dam, we very much concerned about the risk of earthquake and dam collapse.
I'm conscious, did you? No? Sorry, I think because we're nearly out of time, I'm just going to ask, because there was a second part of the question, would anyone like to briefly answer it about what can be done to stop it or who can stop it? We talked a bit about the impacts and the views, but the second part of the last question.
We talked a little bit about potential, like legal options or legal avenues before. So, I think states. I guess we're still hopeful. Some of us in the region who are watching these issues, that negotiations between states and resolution between states can yield a better outcome for communities along the Mekong. That we have. Increasingly, we have tools such as the Mekong River Commission Council study findings, such as some of the research and guidelines that are being produced by the MRC, that if better taken up and really supported, not only by member governments, but I think also by other actors in the basin, by development partners, by financiers, to really get behind looking at alternative pathways, then there is an opportunity to resolve things and find a better way forward for the Mekong River that way. So I guess I would agree with Kun Umbun. I think legal options and dispute resolution options are something to be looked at, both through the Mekong River Agreement, but also through other avenues in international law. But I think the best outcome is if governments, stakeholders, communities in the basin can really come together and find an alternative way forward for the Mekong.
Would Anyone else on the panel in terms of concluding remarks or a direct response to that
hopefully
question?
this is not concluding remarks. I hope somebody else will conclude. I think that it would be very difficult for any bank to pull out from the project. When I tried to, I guess, raise issue with a few bankers several years ago, then even a sympathetic, I would say, a banker who's kind of quite well aware of the controversy and the risk, actually just admitted that, because project finance by nature is consortium of banks. So once you join the syndicate, it's like you've already committed, to the project. And so to him, to pull out, it's not only sending the bad signal that you're like abandoning your borrower, and that's like really bad for your reputation, very bad for relationship with that borrower down the line. But it's also sending very bad signal to the other banks in the syndicate. So I think the idea, the thinking is like, well, any kind of risk management or sort of impact assessment has to be done before committing it to the project. So once the bank's already committed, they have to commit all the way, and everything, from that point is kind of like really they have to, whatever risk there is, they have to bear it, with the borrower. So that's the kind of idea behind. So I think it's very difficult to pull out, but at the same time, I would say once I'm quite sure that more than a few Thai banks will adopt some sort of the beginning of ESG risk management, looking at adopting some environmental, social governance tools, whether it's the UNGP or any kind of tools in a few years. So I think that's a real opportunity to demand that actually use these tools to look at Xayaburi retroactively. In other words, to ask a question, if you were looking at this project, right now with the tools that you are using today, would you finance it? I think that it would be very legitimate. It would be something they should be able to answer, and I think it falls in the so-called responsibility that they announce to the public to be able to answer that. So I think that's something that's very doable. I think that can be done, 1 or 2 years down the line. And also, I think at the same time, the Bank of Thailand as a chief regulator is, I think, very much behind this whole sustainable banking philosophy and practices, and really would very much like to move the field forward. So I think there's also opportunity there to engage with the regulator to, for example, would it be possible for the lenders to this project to sponsor some kind of independent review from the lens of ESG going forward as a way to help them crystallize their sustainable banking guidelines. So I think there's a few ways we can use to maybe not necessarily stop the project, but at least help the financier see better the risk that are involved and see the gaps that happen in their due diligence in the past. One last thing that I'm not sure how possible it is, but to me there seems to be, just reading these materials and listening to experts, there seems to be grounds to believe that the project company misrepresented some aspects of the project to the financiers, right? So for example, project company, they kept insisting that this is run-of-the-river hydropower project. So things like this, I think, should be challenged. I think that normally in any project financing document, there's a few conditions under which banks can stop the loan. And one of those very critical, I would say, violation is misrepresenting facts, material facts to the lenders. So I think if there's a way to turn around some of the experts' findings and civil society concerns into that kind of language and get that in front of the lenders, I think this would be something that's worth exploring as well.
I was reflecting on the panel and the last 9 years, and I guess one concern that I have is that, it became a very polemic discussion about Xayaburi, I think. Kind of winner takes all in a sense, although, compromises along the way. But one of the concerns I have is that those that were questioning the project became framed as kind of against development. And I think this is a very worrying sort of framing that isn't quite right, because another way of, actually, I think the basis of looking at the Mekong, including under the Mekong Agreement, is that the Mekong River is a commons, meaning that it's a shared resource between countries and between people. And therefore, when projects like the Xayaburi are proposed, they can be proposed, but they should be discussed. and not be assumed to be the means to development. So I think we really need to sort of think about this debate not in terms of anti or pro-development, but more about different pathways forwards, because the construction of a project like Xayaburi therefore precludes other possibilities for the future, other relationships with the river and so on. And I think that I teach development studies, and I think that there's an ongoing but quite profound mind shift in really thinking, what does development mean? And whether we're talking about the new technologies, and I mean, many have very much come of age now, whether we're talking solar and wind, energy efficiency and so on, the new context, including the discussions about the impact of climate change, new knowledge, for example, the council study, but then also rethinking our relationship with nature and a far greater emphasis on nature-based solutions. Just last week, I was actually with Dr. Tuan again at a conference about the Delta, and it was talking about mega deltas across Asia and the recognition of the massive threats to deltas from subsidence, from upstream development, from sea level rise, and so on. And so I think the sort of the viewpoint of people's relationship with ecosystems and nature is really being reevaluated. So I hope that that's the kind of framework that we have coming out of what we should learn from Xayaburi and then going forwards. So I hope that can actually be internalized into a broader discussion, that it's not just should a project be built or should it not be built. It's not really even which energy technologies should be built, but a broader set of discussions in society. And I believe that that's also happening. Maybe not urgently enough, but I hope that this panel contributes to that discussion in some way.
สองประเด็นค่ะที่อยากฝากในสิ่งที่เราไม่ได้ค่อยคำนึงถึงกันและก็ไม่มีในรายงานชิ้นไหนที่พูดเรื่องการประเมินผลกระทบก็คือความรู้สึกของคนที่ได้รับผลกระทบแล้วมันถูกกดทับในการแสดงออกการถูกละเมิดในเรื่องราวเหล่านี้เนี่ยมีเยอะมากในพื้นที่เรื่องสิทธิมนุษยชนเวลาที่เราพูดถึงเรื่องเขื่อนเราถูกเจ้าหน้าที่บ้านเมืองติดตามไม่ให้พูดไม่ให้แสดงความเห็นอันนี้เป็นความรู้สึกกดทับและสร้างความสัมพันธ์ที่ไม่ดีกับพี่น้องสองฝั่งโขงนี่ประเด็นแรกประเด็นที่สองที่อยากพูดสำหรับรัฐทุกรัฐรวมทั้งทางเวียดนามทางหลายๆที่โดยเฉพาะของไทยเนี่ยจะมีใครสักคนไหมที่จะมีสักหน่วยงานไหมที่ขึ้นมามองผลกระทบในระดับภาพรวมว่าตลิ่งมันพังไปเท่าไหร่พื้นที่การเกษตรเสียหายไปเท่าไหร่น้ำที่จะแทนที่จะเอาเข้ามาใช้ด้านในเนี่ยมันไม่ได้ถูกใช้ผลผลิตมันหายไปเท่าไหร่กรมโยธาและผังเมืองต้องสร้างตลิ่งพังตลอดแนวนะใช้งบประมาณเท่าไหร่ตรงนี้สำหรับรัฐไทยแล้วนะคือการสูญเสียโอกาสในการใช้งบประมาณแผ่นดินในการไปพัฒนาด้านอื่นกับต้องมาแก้ไขปัญหาปลายเหตุค่ะ
Two points I'd like to make. First thing is a feeling of the affected communities living along the Mekong River. We lack of freedom of expression. We really like to express our concern, but we don't have a chance to speak. State officials many times visit us or press us not to speak the truth. We have been threatened. Second point is that there is no state level assessment to look at how much the region lost in terms of finance, how much Thailand already spent for embankment on the Mekong River to stop the riverbank erosion, for example.
I'd like to wrap up now. I was going to do a summary, but I think Carl sort of summed it up best in terms of how, looking at it from a broader framework, it is not just about pro-anti particular project, but there is a broader context and process at play. What we mean by development, and even when we talk about the Mekong River Commission, you know, elements not only of the agreement, but they talk about their stated vision is economically prosperous, but for me, an important aspect. They also say socially just, but the research and the attention, that does not get enough of the attention in the process. So we are over time, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for sharing different perspectives, not only about Xayaburi Dam and the process, but about broader issues and processes at play in the region and what that means. And there'll be opportunities if you want. Some of them will hang around a bit so you can continue the discussions over a drink. Thank you.